I'm John Easterling, aka Amazon John. Well, that's a nickname somebody gave me just because I've spent so much time the last 34 years in the Amazon rainforest. So I started out as a treasure hunter. I went down back in the 70s looking for lost cities of gold and Inca treasure. And over a period of time, it developed a trade in some ancient artifacts, and then later a lot of ancient textiles and gemstones from Brazil. But ultimately, I was upriver in the Ucayali, and I'd had hepatitis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and some of the Shipibo-Conibo Indians gave me a variety of botanicals. And these botanicals, like Gato, Chancapiedra, Sangre de Drago, turned my life around, because I was still experiencing bouts of fatigue and fever left over from actually a near-death experience I'd had with hepatitis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And so that got my attention, and I maintained a stash of those botanicals. And ultimately, Nicole Maxwell, a lady who had spent a lot of time in the Amazon working with medicinal plants, kind of helped me realize that these botanicals are treasure as well. And then I realized that, hey, as botanical treasure, it's okay to deal with this. And I sold the other company, Raiders of the Lost Art, and began dealing exclusively with medicinal plants. And obviously the focus was on the Amazon, where you've got 100,000 species of plants, and yet only a tiny 3% have been looked at for the therapeutic value, yet almost 30% of your pharmaceuticals come from that footprint of those botanicals. So it's literally the natural pharmacy of the world. And you know, there's an evolution of so many things going on in the world, the information we have access to and things we have access to now. And this, I think, is one of the most important ones, is plant medicine, plant therapy, that all these botanicals that we actually have access to now for our own benefit. So the Amazon John, so I dealt with that for 28 years. I had that company, Amazon Herb Company. About 6 years ago, I had sold that. And that's what kind of led me to cannabis, because being a plant medicine guy, and I look at plants for the therapeutic benefit, and of course there's a whole wave and a whole momentum of recognition about cannabis now. And so as a plant medicine guy, I was very eager to engage in cannabis, specifically as a plant medicine, like all the other ones I've been dealing with for several decades. And really looking at that, and I began growing some for my personal use and researching that, and that has really evolved. This is an extraordinarily important plant, and as a plant, I think it's important for people to really look at it as what it is. It's a plant. It grows out of the ground, just like another 100,000 species of plants growing naturally in our world. And yet the history of cannabis is really interesting. I mean, we've had a relationship with plants. Humans have had a relationship with plants since the beginning of time. Since we came out of caves, we're dependent on plants. We're dependent on plants for food, for medicine, for shelter. So we've always had this relationship. We breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. The plants take in the carbon dioxide and give us back oxygen. So that's an extraordinary part of that relationship. Now the relationship with cannabis goes back to the first recorded use, back to like 1500 BC in China. In their pharmacopoeia, they're mentioning cannabis. So if you look at Central Asia, where cannabis looks like it actually originated, everywhere mankind has moved, he's taken cannabis with him. This is one of the plants that he's taken all over the world. So we've had a continuous relationship with cannabis for thousands of years, until recently it's been temporarily interrupted for about the past 100 years. But when you think about it, it seems so absurd to me. It's so primitive. Even as a caveman, if I come out of my cave, I've got access to the whole plant kingdom. And now the idea that we're taking one plant and kind of restricted its use, it just seems a little bit absurd. So I'm so happy now that we're reestablishing and re-engaging our relationship with this plant, because it has so many benefits that have been recognized for a long, long time. All the cells of our body which have these receptor sites, when they bind in our endocannabinoid system, and it's not just humans, it's every mammal. So it's dogs, horses, we all have this endocannabinoid system. We're able to reestablish homeostasis with our endocannabinoid system. Now, what's important about an endocannabinoid system? The endocannabinoid system actually interfaces with our neurology, our metabolic processes, pretty much every function that we have in our body, the endocannabinoid system influences. So when we reestablish some of those connections to that endocannabinoid system, we actually feed the endocannabinoid system with the cannabis product. We're actually changing so many things in our physiology and the way we express ourselves. And I believe we have the ability to express ourselves at a much higher potential by using cannabis. I had prior experience with cannabis, like so many people. I mean, I went to college, right? That's one of the things that happened. But yeah, in the late '60s, I had my first experience with cannabis, and it was a positive experience. And so I grew my first cannabis in 1970. And it was very crude, very rough, throw some seeds out, in a field and go back and see what you've got, sort of thing. But just my endearment and my connection and my relationship with plants has kind of always been there. But then I segregated that because I was so engaged in the Amazonian plants. And so as that kind of got into a space where I had more time, then like I say, the last 6 years, I've really re-engaged and really focused just on cannabis. I love plant medicine. I love to see people have access to botanicals that can, have a therapeutic value and can change their life for the better. And this is one of the plants, as the rules change and we can re-engage and actually have access to this, I think it's really, really important for people to understand the history of cannabis, that we've had a relationship with it for thousands of years. It's only been temporarily interrupted. We're reestablishing that relationship, and to understand the benefits that are available, because there's so much research going on now. I mean, the world is abuzz with this new research now that the doors have opened again, and the more it's researched, the more jaw-dropping benefits we're seeing with cannabis. And first of all, it was mostly studied for the THC, the tetrahydrocannabinol, because that's the psychoactive component, and people would think that's why people were doing it, and there's some truth in that, because people enjoyed the euphoric part of using cannabis. But there's also in that plant, you're also going to have that other full profile of cannabinoids and terpenes. And depending on the strain we're discovering now, there's a whole variety of strains. As I mentioned, we've taken this plant from Central Asia. It's gone all over the world. And so like any plant, it will adapt to its environment. And as it adapts to its environment, it begins to express itself a little differently in the ratios of cannabinoids and the ratios of terpenes. The terpenes, which are essentially essential oils, that give it the smell factor, right? You have cannabis that smells kind of skunky. You'll have cannabis that smells like a diesel fuel. You'll have cannabis that smells very floral, almost like lavender. You'll have cannabis that smells very citrusy. And that's all about the terpenes expressing themselves. And plants produce terpenes for their own benefit. They'll produce terpenes to attract pollinators, to attract butterflies or insects or pollinators. They'll produce terpenes to defend themselves from their predators. They'll produce smells and things that are obnoxious to things that would take them out. So these terpene profile are really important. And so as cannabis went around the world, you have different strains that have evolved that have different profiles of cannabinoids and different profiles of terpenes. And so for human ingestion, they all connect into the endocannabinoid system and then express themselves. And so there's different strains, for example, that would be better for anxiety or stress or a social mood disorder, depression, and then you get into the therapeutic value of eliminating pain or being valuable for cancer. You know, a lot of these terpenes are what actually help the cannabinoids to express. And some of the terpenes are extraordinarily valuable by themselves, like D-limonene, for example. It's got that citrus smell. And if you're around cannabis and you see one that's got a really citrus kind of smell to it, that's the D-limonene expressing itself. And the D-limonene is wonderful for depression. There's a recent study that showed people, as a hospital setting, they had a dozen people that had showed signs, symptomology of clinical depression. And what they did was just take the D-limonene and put it into the ambient air. So they're just have the ability to smell and to breathe this D-limonene, and 9 out of the 12 kind of recovered and were exhibiting no symptomology of clinical depression. So, and this was just the D-limonene. There's no cannabinoids in that at all. And the D-limonene you also find in like lemon pills, tangerine pills, things like that. So the terpenes, I think, will be one of the next major areas of discussion and study. Now, a lot of it's really about the cannabinoids. I was just in Israel in December visiting with 2 historic figures in the cannabis history, which is Raphael Mechoulam. In the 1960s, he was the very first one to isolate the THC from cannabis, and he's been studying cannabis nonstop for 50 years. He's at Hebrew University now, still studying, still working with cannabis. The other kind of what I call a rock star scientist, Dedi Murray, is up in Haifa near the border of Lebanon at the Technon Institute, and he's been looking at cannabis and cancer, cannabis for cancer. So he's identified several strains that really have an amazing benefit with cancer, at least in a petri dish. And he's looking to take that, you know, he's continuing to study, continuing to take that to higher and higher trials. And ultimately we'd like to see, you know, human clinical trials with that. And a lot of that is about the terpenes. And he's a plant biologist first and a cancer researcher second. So he clearly understands, and in our discussions, that he's very much in alignment with the terpenes are an essential part of helping these cannabinoids express themselves. THC, you know, was known for its, you know, psychotropic effects. Then everyone started genetically, you know, breeding plants to get the highest amount of THC and highest amount of THC, because that's what people were looking at, that's what people recognized, that was what was popular. And now, as we're, you know, and that was mostly while it was kind of restricted use, you know, while it was illegal or in a gray area. But now, as the doors have blown off and we're really looking at this plant for its therapeutic value, we're saying, hey, wait a minute, look at this. All of these cannabinoids are important. All of these terpenes are important. So obviously we shifted the focus from the THC now, a lot of it's gone to CBD, right? Because, why? Because CBD, the cannabidiol, doesn't have the psychoactive effects. So people think, well, that's the medicinal part of it because it doesn't have the psychoactive effects. Well, yes and no. Yes, it's a very medicinal part, but not because it doesn't have the psychoactive effects, because THC has a lot of medicinal value as well. And you can actually make a THC product where the THC is not, say, activated. And there's a decarboxylation or a temperature where you get to that activates THC, because you take a plant that's very high in THC and you cut the top off, you cut off the buds, and you eat that, and you're not going to get the psychoactive effect. You'll get the therapeutic effect of the THCA. It's in the acidic form, THCA, and once it's heated, it converts to THC. You know, there's a carbon bond there that's broken because of decarboxylation with the heat. So if you smoke it, then that breaks that bond, it converts to THC, it's psychoactive. You put it in a brownie and you bake it, now you've got something very psychoactive. If you do not heat it, and in my experimentation with my personal research grow and my personal extractions, I like to use just a dry ice where we're knocking off the trichomes, little trichome heads, which is where your cannabinoids and terpenes reside, and then without heat, and that's very soluble in alcohol. I've always used alcohol as an extraction medium with botanicals for 35 years, and so you can actually get the high amounts of THCA and very low amounts of THC. And if you put that bottle in the sun, it's going to start converting to the THCA to THC, and over time it will naturally convert. But in the beginning, you've got high amounts of THCA, so you get a therapeutic value of THC without the psychoactive activity. CBD is getting a lot of play right now, and it deserves it. Each one of these cannabinoids deserves a stage of their own. CBG is coming on, THCV is coming on, CBC is coming on, CBN is coming on, 144. So we're really in the early stages of exploring, everything that this plant has to offer. Hemp, by definition, is cannabis. When I say cannabis, I'm referring to cannabis sativa. Just the name of the plant, the botanical name of the plant. And hemp would be defined in the way I define it as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC. If it's less than 0.3% THC, you've got cannabis. You could say that's hemp. It's not the definition of, say, marijuana is over 0.3% THC. So if it's less than that, you say this is hemp. So there have been strains that have developed over the years that naturally have less than 0.3% THC. So that would be, you could call that a strain of hemp. And it used to be grown for fiber, for rope, for a whole variety of things like that. And now that we're seeing that CBD is such an important cannabinoid, and that the hemp is a nice source of the CBD, people are using hemp for CBD. There's also strains that have been grown specifically for CBD. I grew one last year, and it came out 20% CBD, 20% CBD and 1% THC. So we can't call that hemp, but it's a 20-to-1 ratio, CBD and THC. So that's pretty extraordinary. So in my mind, cannabis is cannabis. And if you talk to a cannabis plant and say, are you cannabis or are you hemp? It's going to say, I am what I am, But if it's producing less than 0.3% THC, then we call that hemp. And there are many states, I think there's 9 now, that have complete adult use of cannabis in any form, high THC, whatever cannabinoid profile you want to come up with. 9 states have easy access. If you're 21 years old, you're going to have access to it. I think that's wonderful. And that's changing all the time. There's more and more and more states coming on like that. But then there's another 20 or 30 states, I think there's 38 in all now, that have either adult use or medicinal use. And then there's states that only allow CBD. And all that's changing. CBD is kind of the first step. Okay, here's a cannabinoid. Here's a product with this cannabinoid. We're okay with it because you can't get high. And then, your follow-on question was like recreational or medicinal cannabis. Well, the cannabis is the cannabis, And so people use plants. My experience in dealing with plant medicine for 34 years with, maybe 120 different species of plants, cannabis being one of them, people use botanicals because they get a benefit from it. For example, I gave the example of the clinically depressed people in the hospital, and they got a benefit. In that case, it was just the D-limonene. but you also get that same benefit in any cannabis strain that would be high in D-limonene. So all the more citrus smelling plants would be more mood elevators. And so if you have someone in their backyard and say they've rolled up a joint of a tangerine strain because it was so high D-limonene, and they've got the blues, they're bummed out, they're depressed, and they feel better. Well, is that medicinal or is that recreational? Or if you go to the medicinal shop and you get a strain that's high in D-limonene and use it, is that medicinal or is that recreational? I think people use products because they get a benefit. If they're anxious and they use a product and they're not anxious, is that recreational or is that medicinal? So people like to use the CBD because it's non-psychoactive. I mean, the regulators like that. And then the next step is to use it medicinally. But people are smart. That's why they've been using it for thousands and thousands of years, and it's taken it every part of the world they've gone to. Yes, there are strains that you get high, high THC strains. You can get very high and very euphoric, but that's that's short-lived, and you can enjoy that experience. And some people get a little paranoid, but most of the strains now have been kind of bred and developed because no one really likes to be paranoid. So if you're getting paranoid, it's not something you do again the next day, but the strains have been developed so that people can get a benefit that they want, a benefit that is therapeutic, or a benefit that they enjoy. I like the colorful history and the colorful names that have come along, but like you say, that's been in the black market or the gray market, and it's in the market now because that's the history of it, and that's what they're known as. But ultimately, I believe people should you create an expectation of how they're going to feel. I think that's a really a good idea, and the strains. It's just a name given to a certain expectation. Like an OG Kush, if you understand how that OG Kush is going to make you feel, that's one thing. But if you're a novice and that OG Kush doesn't mean anything to you, then it might be nice to have that a little different name so you have a different expectation. And the strains are, like I say, they're just a different profile of cannabinoids and different profile of terpenes, and the way they interface into our physiology and the difference that makes. And we're understanding all those cannabinoids and what their properties are, and all these terpenes and what their properties are. So now we're getting where people are, well, they always have been, but now there's a lot more focus on how do I get this kind of if I'm looking for something, depending on what I want to do, if I'm looking for something for elevating mood, but at the same time, what I really want is to get rid of pain and to facilitate, remission of cancer, then I'm going to want these terpenes. So you start taking plants and breeding those and moving through that process. And it's exciting because there's no end to the possibilities in the specific combinations. Now you ask about, I believe, one thing I see, and I've seen it, it's happened throughout history, and it's happening with cannabis right now. And to me, it's a little discouraging, and that is, when you have a plant in the Amazon rainforest, I can give some examples, Pata de Vaca, Pedro Maca, where these plants are used for reducing blood sugar, okay? For essentially, they're used for diabetes. And drug companies look at that and they say, wow, this really works. This is amazing. We need to make a drug out of this. And so they start running studies on each of the individual components. They break it down because their business model is about selling, isolated isolates for a benefit. And what's happening when they break all that down and they can't get the same benefit as using the plant as it is in a hot water infusion as a tea, how it's been used historically, where a benefit is, they break down all these individual ingredients and none of them work the same way. It's really frustrating for them and they throw it out. In the case of, and other times they do find that, but then when you're using an isolate, our bodies are, like I say, our relationship with plants goes back a long, long time. We eat plants, our bodies understand plants. And when you create these isolates, oftentimes the body doesn't quite understand that because the entourage of other chemistry and nutrition and energetics that are normally around that, we don't quite know what to do with it, and we end up with all these side effects. So the same thing's happening today, I think, in cannabis. People are saying, oh, look what CBD does, so I'm going to make a CBD isolate. So I've got 99% pure CBD. So I don't have any THC, I don't have any of the other cannabinoids or terpenes. I have something that should be really effective. And the problem is you don't get the same effect. In the industry, people are really understanding this. In Israel, they understand this very, very clearly in the research they're doing, that it's that entourage effect where you have even minimal amounts of THC or CBG, CBN, and the terpene profiles. I know I keep going back to terpenes, but I think they're just extraordinarily important, are what really helps that plant express to our endocannabinoid system the benefit that we're looking for in a balanced way. And so so many plants have been made into drugs, and oftentimes you end up with the side effects and things like that, where historically you didn't have those side effects. You had the benefit. Our body understood the chemistry of that, was able to break it down, utilize it, eliminate the difference. And so when we start going to isolates, I don't get very excited about that. Marinol, I believe it was 1980 that Marinol came along as a THC isolate. And so why doesn't everybody know about Marinol and want to get Marinol as a pharmaceutical compound, which is there, it's available in the marketplace, doctors have used it, but what they're finding is it's simply not as effective as a high THC strain with all the entourage and the rest of the components that naturally occur in the plant. In my discussions with Dedi, and he's done presentations about this, around the country and around the world, is when they first identified in his research, okay, here's a strain that is breaking down and eliminating these cancer cells. So originally they were thinking, still a little bit of a drug mentality, okay, well let's see what the ratio is of THC to CBD here, isolate that, and we'll probably have a therapeutic compound. And they did, and it didn't work. So they went back, you need the plant. That's when it was like, okay, it's the rest of the terpenes, the rest of the entourage of the cannabinoids are really helping this thing express in the most therapeutic way. So that's essentially been, I would say that's been proven, and not just in his research, but other research around the world. I would say physicians that really, are focused on the outcome and the benefit for patients have that understanding that hemp, because you've got less than 0.3% THC, could very well be one reason. And it could be focused on CBD when you're dealing with that plant, and it's the entourage. I mean, when you get outside of having that restriction, and then you can really open up the gates for THCA, THCV, THC, CBDA, CBD, CBG, CBN, everything else. And I think that's where the understanding is. I think it's just an experiential thing. Okay, let's start with this, because it's simple, it's available everywhere in the world, without a legal issue, it's non-psychoactive, and so they start with that, and you actually get results with that, but then, wait a minute, look, there's all these other compounds that really play a really strong therapeutic role here, and I think that's what's led them to where they are with that thinking. Value in hemp, if you're getting the right material, because the hemp can still have a lot of profiles of these other cannabinoids. They would just be in much smaller amounts, which is okay because oftentimes it only takes a micro amount to help, play that symphony and to help this star really express itself. The terpenes are really important. A lot of the extraction techniques, tend to eliminate the terpenes, which is not a very good thing. So I think John's point was there's so much material in the marketplace. There's so many claims. We just have to, it's just blinding, and it's true. But it's like anything else. You've really got to take your time, look at who the people are behind it. I think is number one. Do they have a consciousness? And then trace the product back, right, from seed to shelf. Can they show you where this thing's coming from, what the full profile of material is, how they extract it, what they do with it, and then, then ultimately you want to do your own analysis at the end of the day with that finished product. Not only, using it, am I going to get the therapeutic benefit that I'm looking for, but also you want to see the certificate of analysis, and you want to see really what's in that. Yeah, there's so many methodologies of processing, botanicals, and you just overlay that into cannabis now as well. And one of the things where you can really get a good extract using CO2, which is carbon dioxide. However, you got to pay attention to some of the temperature factors there and losing the terpenes along that process. There are some machines being made now that will actually, while that's happening, it will take the terpenes out. You can distill terpenes out with heat and water, right? They just evaporate, but you've got to capture that and then recondense it and then reintroduce it into the product. Some people are doing that, and others are not. So, that's gets back to knowing who's doing it and asking them if they're not expressing that the full methodology they're using in their literature. Then those are questions that you want to ask. Is the plant being heated? At what temperature? And there's heat processes too. I mean, there's all kinds of methodologies of extracting. There's alcohol extraction. There's a lot of mediums of extraction that you don't want to use. I mean, hexane. There's a lot of very toxic extraction materials, and no one legitimately is using those kind of things. But ask about how they're using that process. Some processors now, because they know the terpene or the way it smells, people are beginning to judge it by that. So they're reintroducing food-grade terpenes, terpenes from other plants that have nothing to do with cannabis, just putting that in there so it smells like blueberries. And is that something you really want to be consuming, or you want to go back to the natural profile and protecting and preserving the natural profile of the plants from cannabis, the way that cannabis actually produced in themselves for their own life experience? That's obviously the preferred product, at least for me. So yeah, know your product. There are good products out there, but there's also some products that are, that don't meet that kind of criteria. And obviously my background in Amazonian plants, and when we talk about that entourage effect, oftentimes I find multiple botanicals in a formula are actually very synergistic with each other. And I've formulated that way for 30 years. So naturally my brain went to, okay, here's a cannabis, an extraordinary standalone therapeutic benefit with its own entourage. Is there another botanical with a full entourage of this thing that could be synergistic with that? And the answer is yes. I've looked at probably a dozen at this point, and I found a couple that are quite synergistic that really work with that. And then some botanicals, some non-Amazonian type botanicals that are also synergistic. In regards to the questions you're asking now, okay, how do you choose a product? What's important when you're looking at cannabis and you'd like to get a therapeutic benefit from? Obviously all these things are about education. You really got to educate yourself a little bit in each one of these areas so you can feel confident that you're dealing with someone who knows something about this plant, who's consciously produced a product and something that you can use. So education is really critical. And education, I think, on all the bullet points that we've talked about, we moved really fast and talked about a lot of different categories of the history of the plant, the research that's going on, people's personal use with it, which I think is really outstanding. You wanted to see people that have this issue, they use this product and they've gotten a result. Testimonials are critical. And so one of the best ways you can educate yourself is tuning in to somebody who's really focused in that area. Somebody like the Sacred Plants series has already done a full season of documentaries about this, interviewing patients, interviewing doctors, interviewing people who are engaged in this. And they're coming on with a second series now, which will really get in a lot deeper into this. And that's where I think you're going to get a lot of education and answer a lot of your questions and give you really good guidance on how this particular extraordinary botanical may be of benefit to you in your life.